Oh, hi there. Didn't quite notice you. Since you are here, let me ask you a question. Does this image look cinematic to you? If the answer is no, that's totally fine, but if the answer is yes, can you determine what makes it cinematic? If you're a beginner filmmaker or not a filmmaker at all, that would be quite difficult to do. And to complicate the matter even further, the term cinematic is quite vague. There are no strict rules that will allow you to determine whether one image is more cinematic than the other, or vice versa. But nevertheless, there are still some guidelines that will allow you to push your image into, let's say, cinematic world, where you can further tweak it to your personal liking. And how to do that, we're going to discuss today. The first and the most important part of a cinematic image is lighting, and the biggest mistake of every beginner filmmaker is to blame the camera for poor looking shots, when in reality you can record a cinematic looking image on almost anything, you just need to understand the lighting principles. There are countless tutorials out there that are dedicated to lighting that you can watch, but I'm going to cover the basics here as well. This is the beginning of everyone's journey into the lighting world. Well, at least it was for me. You need to understand, and which is much more important, practice the three-point lighting. This lighting method says that you need to have 3 lights to light your subject. The first one is the key light. This is the main light that is typically positioned at a 45-degree angle to the subject. This is done in order to not only light our subject, but to create some shadows as well. And the sound that you're hearing right now is coming from this creature, this lovely creature. Will you be quiet while I record my video or not? Yeah, probably not. That's what I thought. Film is 2D, so we need those shadows for our eyes to understand the depth of the image. But one light is going to create shadows that are too deep, and that's going to conceal lots of details. That is where our second light comes in. This one is called fill light, and its only purpose is to lift up the shadows we just created. Not diminish them, just lift them up a little bit. So remember that this light should have lower intensity compared to the key one in order to conserve some of those shadows. And now the third light, which is called backlight or rim light. This one is going to add the most cinematic value to your subject and is placed behind the subject to separate it from the background. As I said before, film is a 2D medium. So in order for the audience to understand the depth and at the same time to add cinematic value, always place your camera on the opposite side of your key light. At first, intuition will tell you to place the camera at the same side as your key light, because this way it is possible to make out the most amount of detail. But film is not about the most amount of detail. Actually, it is quite the opposite. Film is the way to tell a story by directing viewers' attention to what you think is important. So forget the details and make your image much more cinematic by filming the shadow side. If you light only your subject and nothing else, you're not going to get something that could be called cinematic. Lighting the background does not only allow us to view where the person is and make an image much more pleasing to the eye, but it also is going to separate our subject even further if you choose the intensity and also the color correctly. Different exposures will make your subject pop even more, and color contrast is an extremely popular method of creating depth in a movie. But do not forget that you need to keep in mind at what aperture you're shooting right now when creating an exposure difference between your subject and your background. If you need to close your aperture significantly to compensate for the extremely bright background, like during a sunny day, not only will you need to light your subject with something powerful, but you're also gonna need to reduce the depth of field. I'm not saying that it's bad, you just need to be aware of that and decide what level of depth of field you're going to use depending on the situation. If you want to reduce exposure and retain the shallow depth of field, then simply use an ND filter. An extremely easy and effective way to make your image cinematic is by creating a silhouette. When you have no budget and no crew but you need to shoot a scene outside, instead of pointing your camera away from the sun and using it as a key light, place your subject between you and the sun and use it as a backlight. It cannot be used all of the time, but when it is used sparingly, it is going to create a cinematic looking image with no budget whatsoever. Now, this is an extremely useful tool that is widely used during professional shooting and almost never used by beginners. All you need to do is to add a little bit of volume to your lighting, and there are actually two ways how you can do that. The right way is to use a fog machine that is going to make your light rays visible in the scene, thus creating that cinematic volume you're looking for. The second way is cheaper and is going to mimic the first one. Use one of these. They are called mist filters and are going to diffuse the light, thus making the light visible and reduce contrast of the image. There are lots of brands who make these, and they are sold in different strength depending on how strong of an effect you want to get. Also, you can recreate a similar effect digitally, but the result is going to be worse. So these were some basic advice regarding lights, and the most important of them all is to practice. By practicing, you're going to notice how a certain light, its direction, shape and intensity is going to affect your image. And we are moving to the second part of every cinematic piece of film, which is sound. Yeah, you heard me correctly. 50% of your movie has nothing to do with how it looks. In order to demonstrate how important the audio is, I'm going to switch to my in-camera microphone while retaining the image quality. You quickly realize, despite the fact that the image is looking good, this video is completely impossible to continue watching. On the other hand, right now I'm using the front camera of my phone, which has nothing in common with the cinema camera. Despite that fact, it is easy to continue watching because of good sound quality. So you need to make sure that you are capturing the best audio you possibly can. I'm not saying that you need expensive gear, no, you just need to follow the basic principles in order to capture good sound. First of all is the proximity. Place your microphone as close to the talent as possible. Then there is the quality of the room itself. If you can, choose a room that has the best acoustic quality in order to achieve clean recordings. If it's not possible, then treat this room with acoustic blankets or anything that is soft and can absorb that echo. And the third piece of advice is post-production. Learn about compression, noise removal, and so on and so forth in order to make your audio sound professionally. Unfortunately, the dialogue is not the only thing that should be present in your movie when it comes to sound. Sound effects are an absolute necessity even for B-roll shots, since without any sound but only music seem hollow and not engaging. Either record them yourself or use one of many libraries that can be found online. Composition rules are typically emphasized in photography and are often forgotten in videography by beginners. But the truth is that poor composition can completely ruin a beautifully lit shot. There are a number of composition rules that after some practice should become second nature. But before that happens, we need to turn on the grid on your camera and position our subject of interest along these lines or at the points where they intersect. This simple yet effective rule will make a ton of difference for any video project you might have. You can also read about leading lines and symmetry, but reading all of that isn't enough. You need to actively apply them until they become automatic. Now let's move to something that is not an absolute necessity but can elevate your movie a lot. I'm talking about cinematic movements. They are a bit tricky. In big budget movies they are used a lot, but each movement should be motivated. If two people are talking to each other, there is no need to add movement, as it can cause unwanted emotions in the viewers. But if there is a lot of tension in the dialogue, then by adding, for example, dolly zoom, we can emphasize that tension even further. If you want to move your camera, but your characters are static, just make them discuss something while they are going somewhere, and now you can move with them and add cinematic movement that is completely motivated. But remember that those movements should be smooth in order to look cinematic. Of course, there are movements implemented in cinema that are far from being smooth. For example, POV shots are always jittery in order to further submerge the viewer into the movie. That's just a reminder that we should not always try to achieve the most cinematic shot possible, simply because our priority is not beautification of every single shot. Our objective is to tell the story that we want to tell in the best way possible. Now let's get back to those smooth shots that are going to add cinematic value. To be precise, to the tools that you can use in order to make them smooth. The first and the easiest one is the shoulder rig. It is not going to provide you with the smoothest shot possible, but it is the easiest one to use. You do not need a lot of time to set one up, and it can be used for a huge variety of shots ranging from relatively stable to a following shot or even fight scenes. If you want your shot to be smoother, then it is time to use one of these. Gimbals. Personally, I hate them. They are not easy to balance, have to be rebalanced every time a lens needs to be changed. They are not easy to operate because you can easily end up with a shot that is too robotic when you want to turn the camera. And in addition to all of that, not every gimbal can fit every camera. But nevertheless, they can give you a really smooth shot that is going to look pretty cinematic. Now let's move to the king of smoothness. The slider. If the slider is motorized, it will allow for a precise and smoothest shot, but it's even bigger pain to set up compared to a gimbal. Using a slider coupled with a tripod is such a pain in the ass, but if your objective is an extremely smooth and controlled shot, this is your best bet. These are just some of the tools that can be used to achieve smooth movements within shots. There are of course much more expensive options and also some DIY stuff that will allow to achieve a similar effect. But again, bear in mind that ideally all of the camera movements should be motivated. Being a beginner, I thought that a mediocre shot can be made beautiful by color grading and that almost everything can be corrected in post. The reality is that a poorly lit shot is going to look bad, no matter what you do with it. Color grading is there to further elevate beautifully lit shot, not to correct mistakes. If you are interested in how to do the color grading, I have a couple tutorials links which can be found in the description. Of course, there is a lot of things that can be tweaked to make an image more cinematic, and I am probably not going to be able to cover all of them. But what I can say is that if you apply all of the principles I mentioned, you are going to end up with an image that is much more cinematic than you started with. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.